As most of you already know, the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, is the primary chemical control law in the United States. Under the TSCA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency regulates both new and existing chemicals. This webinar will address forthcoming changes to EPA's chemical regulatory programs resulting from the recently enacted TSCA amendments. Law number 114-182, the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act, which we'll refer to henceforth simply as Lautenberg, was signed into law by President Obama on June 22nd of 2016. Lautenberg significantly amended the core provisions of the TSCA for the first time since that statute was originally enacted way back in 1976. And as you can see on the slide, some of the amendments took effect immediately upon signature by the President, but most of the amendments won't take effect until EPA either promulgates regulations or develops policies, procedures, and guidance. That said, the law has established deadlines for most of the actions that EPA needs to take. Now, most objective observers would agree that the new chemicals program under TSCA has worked quite well over time, while the existing chemicals program has not worked very well. So it's not at all surprising that the most significant changes were made to the existing chemicals program. Okay. On subsequent slides, we will summarize provisions of the new law that pertain to each of the topics listed on the current slide. And in so doing, our focus will be on what has already changed or what will be changing going forward. Again, we stated that the new chemicals program has worked pretty well over time, and as such, the changes to the new chemicals program under Lautenberg are fairly minimal. That said, there have been changes. In particular, amendments to TSCA Section 5 now require EPA to make affirmative determinations on new chemicals or significant new uses of existing chemicals. EPA actually has to make one of the determinations shown in the middle of the current slide. Number one, that the new chemical or new use presents an unreasonable risk, in which case EPA must issue an order under TSCA Section 5A to address the risk, and they must also promulgate a significant new use rule or SNUR, or explain why they're not promulgating a SNUR. The second possible determination is that the available information is insufficient to permit a reasoned evaluation, in which case EPA must issue an order under TSCA Section 5E and promulgate a SNUR or explain why a SNUR will not be promulgated. And the third determination is that the new chemical or new use is not likely to present an unreasonable risk, in which case EPA must publish its determination. Now, in the case of determination number 3, it's important to note that the submitter can commence manufacturer processing once that determination has been made by EPA, even if the review period has not expired. That is a change from the old TSCA. Another noteworthy change to the new chemicals program under TSCA Section 5 is shown at the last bullet point on the current slide, where we note that EPA cannot apply a SNUR to articles unless the agency finds that the potential for exposure through the article justifies that action. We've already stated that there have been significant changes made by Lautenberg to the existing chemicals program under TSCA, and those topics listed on the current slide are among those where changes have been made. We will discuss each of them on subsequent slides. With regard to reporting and retention of information, Lautenberg made amendments to TSCA Section 8 which will require a reset of the TSCA inventory. This was a topic that was greatly debated in the years leading up to the passage of this law. But the final bill requires EPA to promulgate a rule to require industry to report on the chemicals that they manufactured or processed in the 10 years prior to enactment of Lautenberg. And the purpose of this reporting is to determine which of the TSCA chemicals on the inventory are currently active in commerce. Several important points to note follow below. First of all, the chemicals on the TSCA inventory will not change. However, each of them will be designated as being active or inactive. Another important point is that only active chemicals may be prioritized under TSCA Section 6, and we've not yet discussed TSCA Section 6, but we will do so very shortly. I trust you will agree that this particular provision makes sense. The idea is that scarce industry and government resources not be wasted in evaluating chemicals that aren't even in commerce. With that said, a pre-manufacture notice will not be required to move a chemical from the inactive status to active status. Companies will simply need to notify EPA of their intent to do that. At the bottom of the slide, we know that under Lautenberg, EPA must also continue to use Class 2 as well as Soap and Detergent Association nomenclature. And they also must treat individual members of the statutory mixture categories as being included on the TSCA inventory. And that last point was one that was very important to the industry because there was some question about that under the old TSCA. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to look at provisions for testing of chemical substances and mixtures. And keep in mind that everything we're discussing right now pertains to changes in the existing chemicals program under TSCA as amended by Lautenberg. We see that Lautenberg provides EPA with authority to issue orders to require testing when necessary in order to prioritize a chemical or to conduct a risk evaluation under TSCA Section 6. This is an important change. Under the old TSCA, EPA had to go through a formal notice and comment rulemaking process, which was very time-consuming and resource-intensive. And it often resulted in litigation. Under Lautenberg, EPA is required to use tiered testing approaches, and they're also required to reduce their reliance on vertebrate animal testing, and furthermore, they're required to develop a strategic plan for promoting the development and implementation of non-animal testing methods and protocols. Okay, Lautenberg significantly amended TSCA Section 6 to provide for a prioritization, risk evaluation, and regulation of chemical substances and mixtures. And among the changes that were made by the new law was the establishment of a risk-based process to identify high and low priority substances. And when we speak of high priority substances, what we're talking about is that the chemical may present an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment due to its potential hazards and route of exposure, including exposures to susceptible subpopulations. A low priority designation means that the given chemical does not meet the above standard to be designated as a high priority for risk evaluation. A high priority designation triggers a mandatory risk evaluation, and that risk evaluation is to be completed within 3 years with a possible 6-month extension in certain circumstances. Furthermore, for each risk evaluation completed, EPA must designate a new high priority chemical. And within 3.5 years, EPA must have 20 ongoing chemical risk evaluations. Okay. Continuing to the next slide, we see that the Lautenberg provides for an initial set of work plan chemical assessments. More specifically, it requires that EPA identify a list of 10 TSCA work plan chemicals and to formally initiate risk evaluations for those chemicals by mid-December of this year. It further requires that the agency release the scope of each of those risk evaluations by mid-June of 2017. Lautenberg also established a risk-based safety standard under which chemicals are to be evaluated to determine whether a chemical poses an unreasonable risk. It's important to note here that this risk determination must be made without a consideration of cost or other non-risk factors. And it also must take into account the risk to susceptible and highly exposed subpopulations. In the case where the result of a risk evaluation is that the chemical in question may pose an unreasonable risk, EPA must take risk management action to address those unreasonable risks. Now, in this step of the process, cost and the availability of alternatives are to be considered when selecting among the risk management options. So this is a burden that applies to EPA, and in most cases where there's an unreasonable risk is perceived, there are multiple ways of mitigating that risk. And this is simply stating that in making a determination among those options, those multiple options, EPA does have to take into account costs and availability of alternatives. There is an exemption process for critical uses. And there's also a deadline, as noted in the middle of the slide. Risk management actions on chemicals that may pose an unreasonable risk must be promulgated within 2 years of the completion of the risk evaluation, with the possibility under certain circumstances of a 2-year extension. Another interesting change under Lautenberg is that manufacturers can request EPA to conduct a risk evaluation for a particular chemical. However, if they choose to do so, they do bear responsibility for the cost associated with that risk evaluation. And we note at the bottom of the slide that for chemicals on the TSCA work plan, the manufacturers must pay 50% of the cost of the risk evaluation. For all other chemicals, they have to pay 100% of the cost. Okay, there are certain limitations that apply to manufacturer requests for risk evaluations. First of all, they are granted at the discretion of the administrator of EPA. They do not count towards the 20 risk evaluations that EPA must have underway. And they must constitute a minimum of 25% of ongoing reviews, but no more than 50%. To illustrate that point by example, if EPA is evaluating 20 high priority chemicals, there could be an additional 5 to 10 industry petitioned evaluations ongoing at the same time. In the middle of the slide, we note that Lautenberg established a fast-track process to address certain PBT chemicals that were already on EPA's TSCA work plan. For these chemicals, no risk evaluation is required, only a use and exposure assessment. And rules to reduce exposure to these chemicals, to the extent practicable, must be proposed within 3 years of enactment of the statute, and they must be finalized 18 months later. On the current slide, we note that before Lautenberg was enacted, EPA had already been going through a process of conducting risk assessments for certain chemicals on the work plan. And basically what this slide is saying is that EPA can continue to move forward with respect to the rulemakings that they had already initiated under the old TSCA for the chemicals in question. Stated on the slide, for chemical uses with completed risk assessments showing an unreasonable risk prior to the enactment of Lautenberg, Section 26 of TSCA allows EPA to propose and issue final Section 6 rules consistent with those completed assessments. And that said, that we note at the bottom of the slide that EPA anticipates issuing rules pertaining to trichloroethylene use in spot cleaning, aerosol degreasing, and vapor degreasing, as well as rules pertaining to the use of methylene chloride and N-methylpyrrolidone in paint removers. Lautenberg also included provisions pertaining to mercury export and disposal. More specifically, it amended the requirements of the Mercury Export Ban Act, and it also addressed the Department of Energy's responsibility to designate a long-term storage facility for mercury. It also requires that EPA create an inventory of the supply, use, and trade of mercury and mercury compounds, and prohibit export of certain mercury compounds except to OECD member countries, specifically for the purpose of environmentally sound disposal. As noted on the current slide, Lautenberg has established some new requirements with respect to confidential business information, or CBI. Manufacturers are required to substantiate certain CBI claims, including those for chemical identity for existing chemicals. Another noteworthy change from the old TSCA is that under Lautenberg, all claims are going to sunset after 10 years unless those claims are reasserted by the companies that made them originally. For new CBI claims, EPA must affirmatively review them for chemical identity, and they must also screen a subset of non-chemical identity CBI claims. That subset comprising 25% of all such claims. At the bottom of the slide, we've noted that for past CBI claims, EPA must retrospectively review chemical identity claims to determine if they were adequately substantiated. The old TSCA did include provisions for fees to be paid by the regulated community. Lautenberg made changes to the fee provisions of TSCA as summarized on the current slide. Provides EPA with authority to collect fees from manufacturers and processors who take any of the actions listed. That is, if they're required to submit test data, if they submit a pre-manufacture notice or a significant new use notice, if they manufacture or process a chemical substance that is subject to a risk evaluation, or, as we've already discussed, if they request EPA to conduct a risk evaluation on an existing chemical. EPA will set those fee amounts by rule to defray 25% of the cost of program implementation, subject to an annual ceiling of 25 million US dollars. Okay, continuing, the subject of federal preemption of state and local chemical regulations was a hotly debated topic in the years leading up to the passage of this law. And we note at the top of this current slide that Lautenberg does preserve state authority to act on chemical risks that are not acted upon by EPA. This and all of the other provisions with regard to state and federal preemption of state and local requirements essentially resulted from a compromise between parties representing constituencies with conflicting interests. That said, even in the case where EPA does take action under the TSCA as amended, certain state actions are nonetheless preserved, and that would include those actions taken prior to April 22nd, 2016. These are essentially grandfathered. It would also include actions taken pursuant to state laws that were already in effect on August 31st of 2003. And yes, that would include California's Proposition 65. Actions taken to implement state laws pertaining to air, water, waste treatment, disposal, reporting, and monitoring will also be preserved. And there is a provision that allows for co-enforcement of identical requirements, provided that the penalties imposed by the state do not exceed the federal maximums. At the very bottom of the slide, we note that state actions pertaining to chemicals that are identified as low priority by EPA are also preserved. Okay, the bottom line is that many existing state and local requirements are going to continue to be reinforced going forward, but it's going to be more difficult for state or local governments to impose new requirements in the future. Lautenberg does provide for a preemption of state laws if EPA's assessment indicates that a chemical is safe, or if EPA takes final action to address a chemical's risk. Also, state significant new use rules will be preempted if EPA imposes comparable requirements. Another provision in Lautenberg provides that new state actions are paused during EPA's risk evaluation of high priority chemicals. But if EPA misses their deadline for the risk evaluation, the pause is lifted. Also, if risks are identified, the pause is lifted and states can put new provisions in place, but those provisions will be preempted on the effective date of EPA's final risk management rule. Finally, if EPA determines that the chemical in question is safe, preemption of state and local regulations regarding that chemical will continue. There is a provision in Lautenberg for states to apply to EPA for waivers from either the general or the pause preemptions. Okay, Lautenberg has imposed a number of deadlines upon the Environmental Protection Agency, and furthermore, EPA has set some goals for themselves, even in the case where there's no mandatory deadline. The current slide in the following slide lists some of the actions that you can expect to see within the next year. This is not a comprehensive list. Nonetheless, many of these anticipated EPA actions may be important to many of you. So I will simply, you can read them along with me. EPA does intend to provide stakeholders with information on the statement and certification of CBI claims by mid-July. So in other words, we should expect to see those any day now. Lautenberg includes a provision that requires the establishment of a science advisory committee on chemicals, and EPA intends to publish a notice regarding the establishment of that committee by early September of this year. We stated on a previous slide that certain mercury compounds will be prohibited from export. EPA intends to publish the initial list of those compounds by mid-September of this year. We talked about the rulemaking that EPA was already working on with respect to trichloroethylene, methylene chloride, and then methylpyrrolidone. And here we see that the agency intends to publish a proposed rule for TCE use in spot cleaning and aerosol degreasing by early October. They intend to publish a proposed rule for TCE use in vapor degreasing by early December. And also by early December, they intend to publish a proposed rule pertaining to the use of methylene chloride and then methylpyrrolidone in paint removers. Continuing to the next slide, we see that the agency plans to publish a list of the 10 work plan chemicals and formally initiate risk evaluations on those chemicals by mid-December of this year. They also will publish a proposed rule to establish the agency's process and criteria for identifying high priority chemicals for risk evaluation and for identifying low priority chemicals. That also is anticipated by mid-December, as are the next several actions listed. The agency plans to publish a rule to establish the process for evaluating the risk of high priority chemicals, to publish a proposed rule pertaining to fees, and to publish a proposed rule to require industry reporting of chemicals manufactured in the previous 10 years, all by mid-December of this year. And at the bottom of the slide, we've noted that EPA will publish an inventory of mercury supply, use, and trade within the United States by April 1st of 2017. So we've gone over a good bit of information in a short period of time, and at this point, many of you may be wondering, well, how does this impact me or my business? And that's what we want to talk about on this slide. Basically, the recently enacted amendments have not changed the rules of either domestic companies or foreign suppliers. In the case of domestic companies, that going forward, just as before, they're going to need to take whatever actions are necessary to comply with all those requirements under the TSCA that apply to their business and the chemicals that they handle. And similarly, foreign suppliers will continue, as they did before, to provide the U.S.-based importers of their products with the information that those importers need to comply with applicable TSCA requirements, or in the case where the foreign suppliers do not want to share certain information with their U.S.-based importers, there are provisions whereby they can provide that information directly to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on behalf of the U.S.-based importers who purchase their products. Continuing to the next slide, we've listed some ChemADVISOR products and services that can help you to comply with the applicable requirements under the TSCA as amended by Lautenberg. We are currently in the process of updating our LOLI database, as well as the Global Chemical Regulatory Report for the United States, and our training courses based upon the new law. And that process will continue as EPA moves forward with its implementation plan.